So, friends, we can gently emerge from the solitary practice, and let's open our hearts and minds to two wonderful teachings now from Anguttara Nikaya. And on this theme that we've been exploring, making peace in a world on fire, and particularly considering the Brahmaviharas, perhaps especially karuna, compassion. These suttas are very interesting, pointing to the benefit of practicing these Brahmaviharas to enable us to let go of all the suffering that's been accumulated perhaps for many, many lifetimes. So without any further ado, I'm going to bring up the first sutta today that we can look at. And this is from Anguttara Nikaya. It's Sutta number 10219. So in the Book of Tens. And this sutta is called Kara Jakaya Sutta. The body, kaya, born of deeds, karaja. So we're going to take it slowly, and I'd like to encourage you all to participate, because I think what's really valuable about this Sutta study is the collective wisdom in the space. So here we go. The body born of deeds. The Buddha said, mendicants, friends, I don't say that intentional deeds that have been performed and accumulated are eliminated without being experienced. Intentional deeds that have been performed and accumulated are not eliminated without being experienced. So I think I'd like to stop right there. Let's just tease out the meaning here. Intentional deeds, so karma, that which we've intentionally said or done or even thought, has to be experienced. What does this mean? Would anyone like to suggest, consider, explore what the meaning of this might be? How do we have to experience deeds that we've already done intentionally, or things we've already said, thoughts we've already had? Thank you. Chintana, go ahead.
I would think that it means not denying whatever it is that you have done and actually living through the experience. If you did something, apologizing for it, or perhaps making up for it, and not denying.
Yeah. So there's a sense of result from what we've done, said, or thought. There's a result in the future that we have to experience. Thank you, Chintana. That makes sense. Is that clear for everyone? Or is there any other thoughts, comments anyone would like to add in? So we have to bear the fruit of our intentional actions, words or thoughts, whether wholesome or unwholesome. If wholesome, good result, happy result. positive, beneficial result. If unwholesome, unfortunate result, suffering. This is something we have to experience. So for me, friends, when I consider this, I consider our meditation practice, our life of practice, and how when we practice, we are almost in our meditation, isn't it? It's like an invitation for the unresolved issues, the past karma to arise. We're making space. We're allowing. We're not creating more and more karma for ourselves, more and more suffering for ourselves. We're sitting and we're observing what's already come to pass. And in that way, we enable ourselves to appreciate what's there for us. And the past karmas will arise, the effects, the fruits of our past actions, thoughts, and speech arise, don't they? And we get to witness. Does that? Yeah. We get to witness those things, and we have to bear the consequences, whatever they might be. Yeah, yeah. Okay, let's go back to the sutta. We've only looked at the first line so far. What's next? So just to repeat, the Buddha said, mendicants, friends, I don't say that intentional deeds that have been performed and accumulated are eliminated without being experienced. And that may be in the present life, or in the next life, or in some subsequent period. We don't know when. It's not in our hands, is it, friends? This we cannot control. And yeah, we can't understand the workings of karma. I'm sure you'll all remember how the Buddha stressed that if we try to understand the workings of karma, we just go crazy. It's too much for our small human minds to comprehend. So we have no idea how things will come up, but they surely will. The results will surely manifest. The fruits will surely come to full fruition at some point in the present life or the next life or subsequently, meaning in some future life or lives. And I don't say that suffering is ended without experiencing intentional deeds that have been performed and accumulated. Suffering is not ended without experiencing intentional deeds that have been performed and accumulated. So there we are. Flow, go ahead.
Thank you, Aya. Is the second part about suffering reminds me of I think it's another sutta where one of the monks like had been a murderer at some point before he ordained and was suffering from that. I think it was like people throwing rocks at him or something. And he goes to the Buddha and he's like, "This sucks." And the Buddha's like, "Yeah, that's gonna happen because of what happened before." Is that like what it's saying?
Absolutely. And I tell you what, you've really kind of clinched it with this example of Angulimala, the serial killer. Because yes, exactly. The Buddha said to him, of course, people are going to chuck stones at you. You're going to have a hard time. and yet, Flo, isn't it interesting? He was a serial killer who starts to practices really sincerely, ordains as a monk, follows the precepts, the patimokkha, lives a very disciplined, wholesome life, and becomes fully liberated. And so the result of those incredibly unwholesome deeds is that he gets some stones chucked at him. Not too bad, really. I mean, all of that accumulated negativity, hostility, unwholesome action. And the result was not that he was killed or had a brutal time, but just that he had some difficult moments. Isn't it interesting? The sense of the alleviation of vipaka, the fruits, the results of karma, of action, and how that can be mitigated by our practice, if that's the right word. That can be reduced by our practice. Thank you,
That's
Flo. Yeah, do you want to say more?
one more kind of like, I guess, vocabulary question.
Yeah,
So karma here is being, if I'm understanding right, is being translated as like intentional action. Is the translators putting a lot of emphasis kind of then on the mindset and motivation behind our action as like an important determining factor in how it works out?
absolutely. It's such an important point. We can all appreciate this, can't we, friends? That karma is intentional. It's what we do intentionally that produces the results. And it's not exactly straightforward in the sense that we don't always know our motivation. You know, until we start to get to know ourselves, we can be confused around this. But in simply put, if we intend to do, say, or think something, then there will be a result. And so, yeah, in the case of Angulimala, again, it's very interesting. This serial killer, he had the intention to kill for sure. He did murder. Story goes 999 people. His mother was going to be the 1,000th victim, at which point the Buddha stepped in out of compassion for this man, because the Buddha could see that he had the potential to become an arahant, to become fully liberated. So he stepped in and prevented Angulimala from committing matricide, to kill one's mother or father, or to harm a Buddha or an arahant, is such a heinous act that there's absolutely no chance for such a person to become fully liberated in that particular lifetime. It's interesting to note that it's such a heinous act, but eventually it may be possible. Of course, it is possible for such a person to become fully liberated, but not in that lifetime because of the unwholesomeness of such acts. So the Buddha, saved Angulimala from committing matricide, and he became a disciple of the Buddha. So the Buddha was going to be then the 1,000th victim because he showed up in the forest where Angulimala was lurking, waiting for his mother to come along. His mother just happened to be passing that way. And the Buddha intercepted that and met with Angulimala and, of course, converted him, changed him completely, changed his direction. I'm digressing a bit. What I wanted to say was that Angulimala's intention was to kill, but it was not as brutal as it might have seemed. He thought he was doing um, a sort of, how to say it, spiritual practice, according to the commentaries. His teacher, his spiritual teacher, had somehow directed him in this way, he thought. In fact, he was surrounded by uh, other students who were very jealous of him because he was such a great disciple and student, that they misled him. So his killing spree was not out of evil wishes, wish to harm or hurt anybody whatsoever. It was, in his mind, a fulfillment of his teacher's instructions. Therefore, you could say perhaps the fruit, the vipaka of this intentionality was not as heinous, as awful, as terrible as it would have been if he had a wish to harm and hurt others. Quite interesting. Anybody else like to come in at this point? So I'd just like to come back to the last line that we read together, because I feel there's just so much in every sentence of this sutta. The Buddha said, I don't say that suffering is ended without experiencing intentional deeds that have been performed and accumulated. So, in order to come out of suffering, we have to, in a way, re experience, or how would we put it? To face all the unfinished business, to bear all the suffering that we have been responsible for, in order to say, work through it, to let go. And this is what we experience, isn't it, in our practice? This is just how it is. We sit, we stop. First of all, stop, renounce the world, sit, pay attention to this human heart, this mind, this body, and it reveals all the knots, all the obstructions, all the unfinished business. And we have to witness, bear witness, to feel what we feel, to go through, to, I have the image, friends, of the wheel of Dhamma. The Buddha set rolling the wheel of Dhamma, rolling in the direction of Nibbana. And for how many countless lifetimes have we been rolling in the opposite direction, creating more and more suffering for ourselves through reactivity, through intentionality, through ignorance, through greed, hatred, and delusion. And we take up the teachings of the Buddha, and the wheel starts to literally reverse. And of course, it has to go over all the old ground that brought us to this point. We have to retrace and experience everything that's happened. I like that image. I find that quite helpful. It's literally going in one direction, suffering, samsara, more and more dukkha, and then we come to the Dhamma and we start to move in the opposite direction. Another simile is the swimming against the current of the worldly aims and values. All our lives we've been going this way, and once we start to seriously practice, we start to go against the current of worldly aims and values and incline towards Nibbana, isn't it? By reliving, re-experiencing, facing all the suffering that's there, that's kind of suppressed or, in the mind and heart, that's brought us to this point. Anybody like to come in at all at this point? Otherwise, we can return to the sutta. Okay. So it continues. That noble disciple is rid of desire, rid of ill will, unconfused, aware and mindful. They meditate, spreading a heart full of love to one direction, and to the second, and to the third, and to the fourth. In the same way, above, below, across, everywhere, all around, they spread a heart full of love to the whole world, abundant, expansive, limitless, free of enmity and ill will. I'd like us to consider here, friends, not just the Brahmavihara, the divine abiding of loving kindness, but also the sutta goes on to include and repeat with all four Brahmaviharas. So maybe we can just consider them as we go through the sutta. So to practice loving kindness, radiating forth in all directions, free of enmity, free of ill will, to practice compassion in the same way, to practice joy, mudita, sympathetic joy, rejoicing at the good fortune of ourselves and others, rejoicing in all that is good and wholesome, and equanimity. So considering all four of these divine abidings as we explore this sutta together. So here, the encouragement to meditate, spreading a heart full of love or compassion and or joy and or equanimity in all the directions to the whole world, abundant, expansive, limitless. Then one understands, formerly my mind was limited and undeveloped. Now it's limitless and well developed. Whatever limited deeds I've done don't remain or persist there. Whatever limited deeds I've done don't remain or persist there. So here we are. When we're practicing these divine abidings and giving them our full and complete attention, there's no room there for suffering. So this is really powerful. And of course, we have this teaching again and again in the suttas, this encouragement to practice these divine abidings. So when we make a practice of bringing to mind loving kindness and give it our full energy and attention, also compassion, joy, equanimity, then there is no place in that practice for suffering to manifest, for Mara to get a look in, for the defilements to arise, for the hindrances to arise. Any comments or questions at this point? Have you all experienced or have you made a practice of loving kindness as a sustained practice over time in your meditation daily? And what about the other Brahmaviharas? We did this morning, didn't we? Contemplation of compassion together for not quite an hour. To sustain that, to keep bringing to mind what we're doing and to radiate such a quality. It's not always so easy. Don't know about you. Can be quite challenging. Firstly, to have the concentration, the stability of mind to be able to sustain that practice without getting distracted, without forgetting what we're doing or getting caught up in some thoughts or pain in the body or whatever. So it is a concentration practice, isn't it, friends? It's a focusing practice to practice any of these four Brahmaviharas. So that's one difficulty. And then the other is that we may not actually feel compassion or loving kindness in the moment. In fact, it's really wholesome and really wonderful to bring in these practices when we don't feel these ways. When there's a lot of anger or aversion or ill will in the heart, it's a good time to practice metta. Have you tried that? If you have, anyone, it would be interesting to hear how that is for you, how it's been, how it goes. Ajahn Sumedho speaks about metta practice as a person who, he admits freely, is an aversive type. And so when he practices metta, he has thoughts like, I hate metta. You know, it's not easy to practice metta if the mind is full of ill will. But of course, this is the remedy for ill will, the hindrance of ill will. This is the method to move through ill will, isn't it? And so, how wonderful to try to bring metta into the heart and see what happens when the heart is full of anger, negativity, irritability. Ananaya.
Metta was a practice that was between initially when I first started meditating, went through the initial metta and vipassana retreats. Metta was easy in quotes for me, much easier than formal sitting. I mean, breath work in particular. And I have to say how that's evolved is that now, and especially in our current world climate, where literally the climate itself and all the players, with the war in Gaza and the war in Ukraine and the war, multiple wars in Africa, it's difficult to find the same level of generating that goodwill when to people in charge who are the perpetrators or whatever. But there's a I don't know if it's from the Dhammapada, but when may all those who are suffering, and you can say in the war in Gaza or in Ukraine, or you can name the locations or not, but you name the location and then say, may they be free from all those who are suffering from the war, blah, blah, blah. May they be free from suffering. And you can say then, may they be free from fear, all those who are fearful, all those who are in sorrow and grief. So I find that a way to deal with, it's kind of a blanket one, not so much, it's targeted a bit, but it's a way to send that out into the ether, so to speak, and to include the people who are doing great harm, who are the architects of great harm. And in my reflection, there are several either real dictators or faux dictators or wannabe dictators currently on the political scene. And so I've contemplated that as is there one thing in all those pardon me, in all of those individuals that one could have a positive regard for? Like maybe they really care for their mother and father. Maybe they're really good to their children, or something like that, where there's some, because as the Buddha believed, nobody's 100% anything. And Ajahn Chah, that's a thing. That's one of Ajahn Chah's things, is nothing is 100%. Room to where some kindness and compassion can move in there. I don't do as much. I practice mudita or sympathetic joy or rejoicing more so when something occurs and I'm really glad for someone. I acknowledge that I'm really happy for them, or there's some event or something that's a world event. But I'm not doing that so much as a formal part, like going through metta, compassion, mudita, and then upekkha. And upekkha also is something I strive for. When I feel myself going off here or there, I do my best with practice to come back to some equanimous position where I can just say, you know what? Number one, 100% rule. You don't know all of what's going on there. So to really just sit back and allow it to sort itself into a more balanced place.
Thank you so much, Ananea, for all those reflections. Very helpful. Would anyone else like to come in at this point? Yeah, Flo.
I used to have a daily practice of doing metta. I would benefit from getting back to it, but one thing I feel like I've noticed lately is that there is almost like a tendency, at least in my mind, I don't know about anyone else, to view people who I feel strongly about, kind of positively or negatively, less as people and more as like fictional characters. Like they aren't like a whole person, they're like the bad guy doing the bad thing. And I feel like really intentionally like cultivating compassion involves overcoming the constructed idea I have of the person and try and having to be not just real about like who they are, but also authentic in how I'm engaging with them. Like, oh, if I take you seriously as a full and complete human being, like if I were you doing this thing, like how would I want someone else to respond if they were trying to engage with me compassionately and genuinely and not as like a video game character, like an obstacle to overcome. That's all.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, both Flo and Ananea, for me, you've both pointed out how it is that we can feel that we understand situations and people, and yet we can reflect that actually it's very difficult to have a grasp of what's really going on. I mean, it's difficult to have a grasp of what's going on here, never mind for someone else. And that's such a helpful reflection because we do tend, I think, to see things in a way, to a degree, black and white. We want to understand, and so we want to categorize and pigeonhole things and have the good and the bad, and it's often not so straightforward. And that the nuance that Ananea you bring in there when we bring up reflections on equanimity, practice equanimity, we can start to see the bigger picture and to consider not knowing, just not really fully comprehending any situation. And this is so helpful as well, to help us to let go of our views and opinions about things, which can often crystallize into, again, the black and white. And that is such a disservice for ourselves and for the people around us if we allow that to happen. So, what is the Buddha's advice regarding opinions and views? It's to let go of them, to really rest in the unknown, the uncertainty of things. So, that's so helpful, that aspect that you've both brought in. And yeah, thank you, Ananea, for all those ways in which you consider metta practice, mudita practice, and the difficulty when we consider the particularities in the world, the people, the situations. It's interesting, isn't it, friends, that in the Pali Canon we really can pick up that the practices of the Brahmaviharas are, as it says in this sutta, just a sentence or so back, to be practiced in this unconditional way, like in all the directions, meaning really not focusing on any particular person or thing, but rather just a non-discriminating radiation of love, compassion, joy, and peace. And I consider that. Ananea, do you want to come in?
Well, I just wanted to add that I really love Ajahn Sumedho's talks because I have so many personality traits in common. If you read his history and what he says about the years of his practice and from the beginning, with his years with Ajahn Chah to the present, because I have aversion is an aversive personality also, and so I have found and so the Brahma Viharas for me are really just excellent, and I have to say I really see the fruit of that in my thinking and in my relationships with people. And I've mentioned this before, I think perhaps when you were here too, but about irritation and really working really concerted effort on irritation, because obviously irritation can grow to bigger things, but irritation is like, especially if you're an aversive type, you don't have to go very far in any direction to find it. It's rising up, just like bubbling up. I mean, I took a road trip this past week, and so I'm driving down Highway 101 for an extended period. And actually, it was really pretty. That was pretty benign. But people, can be very unconscious, and so they do some really dumb stuff, and potentially dangerous too. But even at that, it's just like it's not helpful to like, oh, what, that have that reaction about something, pulling some bonehead thing while they're driving, because behind that also is a conceit that I know what the proper driving is in all circumstances for all people. So that's, there's a really deep-seated level of that goes along with that aversive type of thing. They're holding something to some, standard or some golden something, and that I'm the arbiter of. So that's an ongoing thing, but it is getting better, I have to say. And soon I'll be too old to drive, so that'll take away a whole big, huge piece of what's irritating in my life.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's wonderful, isn't it, to see, as you've just pointed out, the fruits of the practice. And it's just as in this sutta, the sense that if we can practice these strong tendencies and inclinations that we have, can, wear away gradually. How wonderful is that? It's really worth noticing, isn't it, when the short fuse becomes just a little bit longer. How beautiful. And again, bringing in the wisdom of seeing that so much of our experience is limited, subjective. Let's remember that. We don't really know. What we have is to deal with the reactivity here, whatever it is. And having that kind of perspective as well of equanimity, bringing in the equanimity for me is also to not get into judging, self-criticism. We don't judge others, we don't judge ourselves, because we don't really know. Just deal with whatever arises, and not add on any extra layers, of criticism and aversion towards this suffering here. How helpful, how helpful. Yes, Ananea, if one is an aversive type, which is probably an awful lot of us, then the Brahma Viharas are hugely important to just keep bringing them in, just as it's indicating in this sutta, how to alleviate all of this suffering, all of these deep-rooted tendencies, the 4 Brahma Viharas. Let's go back to the sutta, friends. So now, practicing loving kindness, compassion, joy, equanimity in all the directions, without discrimination, spreading a heart full of love to the whole world. We can understand. Formerly, my mind was limited and undeveloped. Now, it's limitless and well developed. And whatever limited deeds I've done don't remain or persist there. This purifies the heart, these practices. And the Buddha goes on, what do you think? Suppose a child had developed the heart's release by love from their childhood on. Would they still do any bad deed? No. not doing any bad deed, would they still experience suffering? No. For if they don't do any bad deed, from where would suffering afflict them? This heart's release by love or compassion, also joy, also equanimity, these heart's releases should be developed by women or men, for neither women nor men take this body with them when they go. The mind is what's inside mortal beings. They understand whatever bad deeds I've done in the past with this deed-born body, I will experience here. It will not follow me to my next life. The heart's release by love, by compassion, by joy, by equanimity, developed in this way, leads to non-return for a wise person here who has not penetrated to a higher freedom. So there we have beautiful encouragement. Through these practices, we can really develop hugely on the path to liberation, all the way to non-return, if we haven't even become fully liberated. The heart's release. Whatever bad deeds done in the past with this deed-born body, to be experienced here, not then to follow into another life and another life. So this is such a beautiful sutta and powerful encouragement for us, isn't it? That we can apply ourselves to this practice, use the Brahmaviharas to ward off the hindrances and come out of all the past karma, all the past suffering. We don't have to feel that it's impossible, however much we've done or said or thought that's unskillful in this life, however much we feel we have a lot of suffering in our minds and bodies, perhaps even from past lives. These practices can kind of penetrate the darkness, and move mountains of past karma if we can practice skillfully in this lifetime. So I find this a great encouragement, and it really is helpful then for us to keep applying these qualities, keep cultivating these qualities. And as you said, Ananaya, when we look around us at our situation now, we can feel overwhelmed sometimes by the suffering here, by the suffering over there. Are they different? Not really. This is where we are. We're all part of this situation that we find ourselves in. And not easy times. I'm sure people always say that. We live in not so easy times, but it really feels there's so much injustice, so much suffering, so much horrific human activity, human harm happening around us. And then we have climate change, we have environmental degradation and so forth. So all of these issues can be very present for us. And yet, we have the guidance right here in this sutta, how to find our way, how to rise above, not to dissociate from, not to be indifferent to. Equanimity is not that, is it? Equanimity is an intimate connection, an intimate or an intimacy with whatever's happening. It's not turning away. Compassion is turning towards suffering, facing suffering, but with the skillful, resourced heart that can, as we all can, right, wish well. As you said, Ananaya, may there be peace for these people. May there be resolution of all this suffering. May all beings be free from suffering. So these practices have such a power and can literally take us all the way to Nibbana. If we were to dedicate our entire life to practicing one or all of these qualities, bringing them to mind and cultivating them, that would be sufficient for us. We would be practicing well. Any comments, reflections, questions about this sutta? We've now concluded this sutta because it simply repeats regarding the other Brahmaviharas. Wonderful. Well, we can move on to the next sutta, which is a very famous sutta. I think many of you will have heard of this sutta, will have read this sutta, and perhaps will have studied this sutta before. It is a lump of salt. Lonaka Pala Sutta. It's Anguttara 3:100. This beautiful simile. Here we go. The Buddha said, suppose you say, no matter how this person performs a deed, they experience it the same way. This being so, the spiritual life could not be lived, and there'd be no chance of making an end of suffering. So just say that again, and we'll let it sink in. No matter how we perform a deed, we will experience it the same way. If this is so, the spiritual life could not be lived. There'd be no chance of making a complete end of suffering. So what does that mean to you, friends? However, is karma fixed, like a mathematical equation, 2 + 2 = 4? Or is, as we've heard in the last sutta and we've been discussing, is there a way in which there can be alleviation of result? Flo brought in the example of Angulimala, murderer, killed so many people. If there was no way to come out of that result of all of that harm, then Angulimala could never have become a fully liberated person. Does everybody? Yep, Flo, go ahead.
If I understand right, it's the way I've kind of like visualized it in my head is like we do a thing and it creates like comma going forward that's like a line, and then it intersects with how we, I guess, like respond or engage with or do something around it, like coming into being, and that changes sort of like what the actual fruit of the action is. I think it's saying that.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you, Flo. Yeah, I think for me it's like I'd put it in that way, or like say that through practicing skillfully the Eightfold Path, practicing the Brahmaviharas, as in the last sutta, we can moderate and, in a way, alleviate suffering. And the karma is transformed potentially by our practice. And isn't that what we experience, friends? I've had experiences in my meditation practice of a sense of a real lifting of heavy karma, heavy suffering, dark suffering held in the body. And through mindfulness, through patient endurance, through loving kindness, compassion, just softening the edges of suffering, investigating what's going on slowly, slowly. There can be a lifting, and then perhaps one could say even a dissolution of obstructions, of blockages, of held, say, like traumas in the body, in the mind. This practice is so powerful, is it not, friends? We can not necessarily fully understand what's happening, but we can investigate the Dharma and enable anicca sanya, enable things to change through insight. Richard.
Thank you, Ayya. In my mind, what this is saying is, okay, Buddha said to the monastics that this monastic group, the Sangha of monastics, is your family. So the materialists, they have a family too. The Sangha, they have a family. The materialists acquire food and clothing and a place to live and whatever too. The monastic acquires clothing and food and a place to live too. The difference is the worldly person is doing it for worldly activity, is not thinking how to transcend the world. They're just trying to think of how to survive and enjoy and everything in the world. The monastic, doing the similar activity, right, is thinking, let me do these things for my benefit of transcending the world, right, of achieving nirvana, and so that my fellows in the holy life can also, right, my other monastics. It doesn't have to be fellows. That's just the word I think is used in one of the suttas. You know, can also achieve nirvana. So, anyways, that's just the way I see it. But thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Richard. That's a beautiful, helpful perspective for us to take in regarding this sutta and also regarding the last sutta. Wonderful. Ananea.
Well, with this one, it seems that the chief difference is that a person who is not a practitioner has an experience or has something happen and they experience it and then that's it. Whereas someone who is practicing or aware of the Dhamma senses it, feels it, and experiences it, and then has the recognition of whatever that brought to it. So it's like not just taking a simplistic view or assessment of activities or things that occur, especially things if they have a negative impact or some really strong impact. I actually went to Nisro because translation, because this one anyway, and the way he says it just was a little easier to digest, I thought, at least for me. And that was the basic, I'm kind of summarizing his basic way of stating that.
Thank you so much, both of you. Yeah, friends, it's really good to look at different translations. I'm glad you mentioned that, Ananea, because yeah, if we don't know Pali, which I absolutely recommend learning Pali, because that gives so much more depth to these teachings. But if we don't know Pali, it's good to look at a number of translations when we look at a sutta, because it just gives so much more dimensionality to it, so much more depth. So that's wonderful. I must look at Tanisro's translation. I haven't looked at it lately. That'll be great. And also, yes, Richard, thank you for bringing in the practitioner's perspective. That is so, that is what these suttas are pointing to, the transformative capability that we have as practitioners. I think whether monastic or lay, if we're practicing really seriously, we have that heart of renunciation, and we're working to come out of the past conditioning, to let go of karma, to free up from all of the greed, hatred, and delusion that might be here for us, that we're facing. So facing dukkha, and then the result of that is so inspiring. Practicing the Brahmaviharas, as in the last sutta. And let's go back to this sutta and see where it's going to take us. So this statement, no matter how a person performs a deed, they experience it in the same way. Is that true or not? No, it's not true. It so depends on how we live and what our present intentionality is, what our practice is. If it was so, if karma was fixed and the results were fixed, we would not be able to live the spiritual life. There'd be no chance of making a complete end of suffering. We would just keep rolling along. The wheel of samsara would just keep rolling. There would be no way for us to turn things around. To continue the sutta. Suppose you say, no matter how this person performs a deed, they experience the result as it should be experienced. This being so, the spiritual life can be lived, and there is a chance of making a complete end of suffering. So whatever deeds have been done, we will experience the result as it should be experienced. There's this incredible, how to say, the word Dhamma, friends. One of the meanings of the word Dhamma is the law of nature, isn't it? It's the law. There is this incredible beauty, this incredible. I'm not very good with my words today. There's an incredible justice, we could say, in the situation that we find ourselves in. If we incline our hearts to freedom, to the good, we follow the Eightfold Path, then there will be results that will be good results for us. And even if we have an accumulation of unwholesome karma from the past, the fruits of that karma will be altered by our practice, will be according to the way we practice, so will be the result. There is hope in that sense. There is the possibility for liberation because of this, because there is this flexibility. It's the other way round. Just to come back to the sutta, let's look at these two statements again. First of all, no matter how we perform a deed, we'll experience it the same way. No flexibility, no possibility of getting away from, freeing up from unwholesome past karmas. This, fortunately, is not the way it is. The way it is, the Dhamma, is this. No matter how we perform a deed, whatever we've done, the experience of results will be as it should be, according to our practice, according to our current intentionality, according to the development that's happening, whether it's development in a wholesome direction or in an unwholesome direction. And here we have an example. Take the case of a person who does a trivial bad deed, but it lands them in hell. Meanwhile, another person does the same trivial bad deed, but experiences it in the present life without even a bit left over, let alone a lot. What kind of person does a trivial bad deed, but it lands them in hell? A person who has not developed their physical endurance, ethics, mind, or wisdom. They're small-minded and mean-spirited, living in suffering. That kind of person does a trivial bad deed, but it lands them in hell. And what kind of person does the same trivial bad deed, but experiences it in the present life without even a bit left over, let alone a lot? A person who has developed their physical endurance, who has developed ethics, who has developed mind and wisdom. They're not small-minded, but they are big-hearted, living without limits. That kind of person does the same trivial bad deed, but experiences it straight away or soon after, the vipaka, the result, without anything left over, not a trace. It's finished, it's gone, it's over. No unfinished business. And then the Buddha gives this beautiful simile. But before we come to the simile, I'll just pause and see if anybody would like to come in with any comments, questions, reflections. There it is. I mean, that's beautifully put for us. The two extremes, the two ends of the spectrum, but from this we can glean how it is. Makes me think of another example. You know, you do something unwholesome, you harm somebody, even whether it was intentional, fully, consciously, or whether it's a word that slipped out in anger, reactivity. So you say something, you offend and insult and upset somebody, even traumatize them. It's done. But in the moment, we can then reflect. And we might be a person who's mean-hearted, small-minded, and think, yeah, well, they deserved it. I was right to say that. I'm still annoyed. And not seek any kind of resolution of that issue. And so we will be continuing that suffering until we face up. And then a person may reflect and feel remorse and want to make amends straight away. If they're a good-hearted person, if we're good-hearted, as I'm sure we all are, and we all have this tendency, if we've hurt or harmed somebody, to very quickly want to make amends, to put it right, to apologize straight away. How can we sleep? How can we rest if we know we've hurt or harmed somebody and we haven't put it right as best we can? And that intention to make amends, doesn't that make all the difference in the world? And we can deal with the situation and it can be finished and completed for us, and hopefully for the other person too. We have all the resources as practitioners to work in all different ways to alleviate the suffering, to finish our business, don't we? And as in the last sutta, we can consider straight away the power of loving kindness, compassion, equanimity, to bring those to mind, to bring them into the heart at such a time. And the behavior, speech, thoughts will be colored by our skillful practice, and we'll do the right thing. We hardly even have to consider what to do, but rather to feel the remorse, to bring up the good qualities and allow the right things to happen, to heal and to, move forward, to let go of the suffering. How beautiful. Richard.
Thank you, Ed. This word here, papakamam, I know it's usually translated as bad or wicked or something like that, but they're talking about someone who has, kind of moved their mind in the direction of nibbana, right? but it can also mean unfertile. So I think what the Buddha is saying here is that, okay, even someone, let's say a noble disciple, is moving, it does something that's unfertile. It doesn't produce a good result. It's like throwing a seed in, an unfertile ground, right? It's not going to grow anything, right? Oh, well, he just moves on. The worldling doing this might be upset and angry. Why am I getting, what I want? And, you see where I'm going with this? Anyway, I'm not saying I'm correct, but this is something I looked at a long time ago. And as we were reading the Sutta, I said, I think there's something here. And I went and looked at the Pali, and it triggered the memory in my mind about it, that I had studied this very fact, because it seemed a little incongruent to think of a noble disciple really being a real evil, wicked person. You might do something by accident or something like that, or you might have. Buddha says you can even the first two levels of noble disciple can even break a precept, but they're going to break in a mild way. They're not going to go and become a serial killer. So that's why I'm thinking that I think it's more of like, just you may do some action that's not really worthwhile doing or good or whatever, but you can see through that and say, yeah, okay, yeah, I shouldn't do that again. And that's why I said it just leaves it behind. You know what I mean? In the sutra, just leave that behind, and he moves forward. It's not a thing that he dwells on. Anyways, it's just an idea. I might be wrong, but I just thought I'd throw that out there for people to think about. Anyway, thank you for listening.
That's fabulous. Thank you very much, Richard. Yes, yes. And it is interesting here. This word papa literally is often, isn't it, translated as evil. And many times we have this discussion, is there such a thing as evil in Buddhism? Not really. Not really, because the source of all unwholesome deeds is actually ignorance, confusion. I mean, who in their right mind would harm themselves, And when we do a harmful deed or have harmful thoughts or harmful speech towards others, first and foremost, we're harming ourselves. And so we have to be kind of crazy to do that. So, it's not that people are evil as such, it's more like deeply confused. And I feel, Ananea, this can help with the mind that sees so much unwholesomeness around us and feels, well, it's very difficult to forgive, to feel compassion, to feel loving kindness for such people, for such deeds. And yet, if we consider how confused these beings must be, because who would want to harm themselves to such a degree to, produce the fruits that they're going to reap in later lives, if not this life? Who would want that for themselves? So, yeah, I think that's really helpful to bring that in, Richard. And also in the context of our practice, friends, I consider this word papa translated as evil to be helpful, because just a thought here, Richard, something around the more we refine our behavior, thought, and speech on the path of practice, and we're working to be harmless to ever greater degree, then if we do hurt or harm another being in any way or ourselves, that for us can feel like a very evil thing, it may not look like so terrible to say something hurtful to somebody, but within the heart of a person who's really sincerely practicing for liberation, that can feel like a very evil thing and something that must be rooted out. Some amends must be made. And I think we know, don't we, when something needs to be healed and worked towards healing through some sort of behavior or speech, or giving time and attention to that resolution, and when we can just literally put something aside because we know that we didn't intend any harm and we can move forward very quickly. So these are just some reflections on your reflection there, Richard, with gratitude for bringing that in. Anybody else like to come in at this point before we come to this beautiful simile of the salt? Okay, let's go back to the sutta. So there we are. A person does some trivial bad deed, and depending upon the state of mind, the practice, the situation of that person in terms of their physical endurance, their ethics, their mental development and wisdom, the result will be in accord with that. A small-minded, mean-hearted person can be in hell as a result of that deed, trivial bad deed, and a person who has great heart, great wisdom, virtue, not even a bit is left over, not to speak of a lot. Suppose a person was to drop a lump of salt into a small bowl of water. What do you think? Would that small bowl of water become salty and undrinkable? Yes, of course. Why? Because there's only little water in the bowl. And suppose a person was to drop a lump of salt into the Ganges River. What do you think? Would the Ganges River become salty and undrinkable? No, of course not. Why? Because the Ganges River is a vast mass of water. That is how it is. In the case of a person who does a trivial bad deed, but it lands them in hell, the little cup of water becomes very salty. Meanwhile, another person does the same trivial bad deed. Salt in the Ganges, spoonful of salt in the river. It's gone. Not even a bit left over, not to speak of a lot. And here we have another simile, friends. Take the case of a person who's thrown in jail for stealing half $1, $1 or $100, while another person isn't thrown in jail for stealing half $1, $1 or $100. What kind of person is thrown in jail for stealing half $1? A person who is poor, with few possessions and little wealth. That kind of person gets thrown in jail for stealing even half $1. What kind of person isn't thrown in jail for stealing even $100? A person who is rich, affluent, and wealthy. Now, that kind of person isn't thrown in jail even for stealing $100 or more. This is how it is. In the case of a person who does a trivial bad deed but goes to hell, as in the case of the poor person who steals a little bit. Meanwhile, another person does the same trivial bad deed but experiences it in the present life with not even a bit left over, not to speak of a lot. The rich person who steals can move on quite happily, free to continue. It's like a sheep dealer or a butcher. They can execute, jail, fine, or otherwise punish one person who steals from them, but not another. What kind of person can they punish? A person who's poor, with few possessions and little wealth. This kind of person they can punish. What kind of person can't they punish? A ruler or their minister who's rich, affluent, and wealthy. This kind of person they can't punish. In fact, all they can do is raise their joined palms and ask, "Please, good sir, give me my sheep or pay me for it." This is how it is in the case of a person who does a trivial bad deed, but it lands them in hell. If you're poor, you can't get away with much. If you're rich, you can get away with a lot. Not that you would want to do harmful things, unwholesome things, but if you do, there's a alleviation, there's a watering down. They are, what's the word? Dissolved so much more quickly if you have a great heart as opposed to a small, mean heart. Mendicants, friends, suppose you say, no matter how this person performs a deed, they experience it the same way. This being so, the spiritual life could not be lived. But if you say, no matter how a person performs a deed, they will experience the result as it should be experienced. This being so, as it is, the spiritual life can be lived, and there is a chance of making a complete end of suffering. Ayya. So, friends, these examples, I really like the example of the salt in the river or the cup, because it sort of doesn't have any resonances somehow on a human level. The examples of the pauper who steals and the rich person who gets away with stealing have a little bit more like, I don't know, they bring up different things for me in my mind. So they're slightly more complicated due to my own conditioning. But I get the picture. It's really saying, comparing a poor person with a person who is spiritually poor, who's spiritually, one could say, not trying to alleviate suffering, but rather caught up in the continuation of suffering in samsara. And the rich person is the person who is practicing for liberation, who is living a wholesome life, who is striving to uproot the defilements and to avoid any kind of harm to others. This is how I help myself to understand better. Ananea.
Yeah, I'm glad you point that out. But again, this is why I really liked Tanisha Bhikkhus, because he actually fills it in and makes it much more explicit that a person is wealthy, and it's wealthy because of their practice and their diligence and all of that. Not so much that just because they are have money or whatever. Anyway, I recommend having a look at that at his translation.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much, Ananea, because I think, yes, it could, it's helpful perhaps to clarify that. I could imagine that being helpful, and I will certainly be reading, and I hope you all will also look up Tanisro, Venerable Tanisro's translation. Sharanya.
Thank you, Ayya, for leading us through this discussion. So I was just reflecting on kind of the privileges and the benefits we have. And if my understanding is right, that this journey is not a linear projection, right? So for instance, in this lifetime, I could have wealth and certain comforts, but if I am not practicing generosity, then the reverse could happen at some point, either in this lifetime or in a future lifetime, right? So the element of choice really matters. But I was also thinking about how unfortunate it is, because I know people who have had all the blessings, right? Beauty, wealth, health. And I think because they don't hear the Dharma, so they probably got all of that because of their past good deeds of generosity and right speech and all of those things. But because they don't get to hear the Dharma, they don't get an opportunity to practice this in this lifetime, and they have all of these privileges. And then it really opens up the doors to a either more painful rebirth or a human life that is not so advantaged as of now, right?
Yeah, there are two excellent suttas on karma in the Majjhima Nikaya, and one is really saying there's no way we can understand the workings of karma, and the other just briefly is saying, yeah, there is cause and effect, and you can be pretty sure just as you said, Sharanya, if one is generous, free-handed, giving, has a heart of generosity, of letting go, then you are going to, the result of that, the fruit of that will be wealth. And the same with, kindness and a loving heart, goodwill towards others. One will be very beautiful. That's the result of practicing metta, and so on. And so we can appreciate that that really makes sense, right? And as you say, if we're practicing, then we're likely to appreciate any benefits that we have in this life with great humility, not to take them for granted and not to rest back, as it were, on our laurels, and enjoy all the good things we have, but rather to recognize that, well, if we are not cultivating now, then we're not going to be moving in the right direction. We want to keep developing good qualities, and then we will maintain the fortunate situations that we find ourselves in. If we turn away from that and become stingy, or allow the unfortunate qualities to manifest, then we're going to be heading in a different direction, not a very happy one.
Well,
I think,
oh,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
but it's also possible that a next lifetime might happen where I don't hear the Dhamma. And so I'm not aware of these things that I could cultivate, right? And so then I could just fall off the bandwagon, right? Or does the karma that I'm cultivating now has enough momentum to carry through different lifetimes? It's a question no one can answer, right? But
yeah, absolutely. We just do not know. I mean, when we start to practice, we can just appreciate that whatever's happened in the past, whatever's brought us, to this point, kind of almost in a way, we want to relate to it in a way that is for liberation, to practice for nibbana. So to investigate intellectually and to try to understand the workings of karma in this way is not very constructive use of our time. But if we actually come into the practice of meditation and pay attention to this body, this heart and mind, then we can really investigate and root out, the causes of suffering, root out the defilements, and that is the best use of our time. So I can understand the Buddha's teachings that, don't try to understand karma, because it's impossible for us to really know, but do practice for, first of all, practice virtue, so that we are improving our situation constantly. You could say we're moving in the direction of happiness and well-being, and then purify the heart through practice, through following the Eightfold Path in all of its aspects. Purify the heart, and then we're actually letting go of the causes of suffering. And this is a whole extra dimension, really. So many religions encourage us and teach us, as in Buddhism also, to do good, avoid harm. And that's crucial. That is going to maintain our, you could say, good fortune. Our good circumstances will be maintained in that way. And then the extra dimension, also in many religions, and here we have in the Buddha's teaching, purify the heart. So to root out the causes of future suffering. And in this way, we're actually, our aim is not to go up in terms of, better birth, better rebirth, heavenly rebirth, angelic rebirth. We don't really want that. We want something much more stable, secure, much more a refuge, is to let go of all of that wanting, to let go of desire, to let go of the root causes of suffering and step off the wheel of birth and rebirth, birth and death, birth and death. We don't want to go up, we don't want to go down. If we practice virtue, we will not go down. We might actually, because we might have some causes for unfortunate rebirth. We just don't know. But we're helping ourselves if we practice virtue. But a lot more importantly, we want to develop path and incline always the heart toward nibbana, to letting go, to seeing the desire and not following it, to stepping back from all of that suffering, to stepping off the wheel of suffering. So thank you, Sharanya. Anything you'd like to come back with on that?
Well, there's so much, but I think nothing intelligent enough to respond with, but just, I guess, to just keep at the practice.
Sadhu.
It just seems like it's so complicated and so difficult, and there's so much that takes us away from that. But it's worth kind of putting the effort. So thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Practice for liberation. Do good, avoid harm, and purify the heart. And I think for most of us, that purifying of the heart requires meditation practice. And really develop the samadhi, the mindfulness, the right effort, these aspects of path, and to really put a lot of energy into that and to make time for that. There's nothing more important, really. Everything else is lost. This is our salvation. This is our redemption. And so to give as much time and effort as we can to developing right samadhi, right mindfulness, right effort. Thank you so much, Sharanya. Richard, and then we'll have to close, friends. You're muted, Richard.
Thank you. If you click on the word that's translated here as hell, Nirayam, you'll see in the bottom that pops up in Bhikkhu Sujato's system. He says it literally means no good result. Now, you notice that the Buddha is saying here, these are trifling things. He doesn't say these are really horrible actions that you're doing. They're very trifling. So the bhikkhu, with this expanded mind, he goes out on his daily alms round one day and he gets no food. Okay, tomorrow's another day because of the state of mind he's in, right? So it's like a little bit of salt in the river or the lake or something like that, right? But the worldly person goes out on the alms round, not alms round, but whatever they do to try to get food, right? And they get no food, and it's like, oh, a crisis. You see? So because of this no good result, they're like in anxiety and fear and feeling, lots of hunger pains, and why is the world so cruel to me, and whatever. You know what I mean? So because there's a sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya where Buddha says that there is no hell below the great ocean. He says hell is just like, these painful mental experiences, that you got. I'm just paraphrasing it, but it's a very short little sutta. So I think, especially because he keeps saying these are trifling things, he does a trifling, action, right? Not very good action, however you want to put it. And so that's what I was thinking, like the total difference in the mind of a developed individual and an undeveloped individual, and how much grade or pressure, whatever they put on. Anyways, that's just my thought. Thank you very much for listening.
Beautiful. Thank you, Richard. It's a lovely example there. So we can all relate, can't we, friends? What an encouragement these two suttas are. For me, the first sutta, to remember to bring in the Brahmaviharas, bring in loving kindness, bring in compassion, joy, gratitude for me is part of that. Bring in appreciation, bring in peace, bring in equanimity. Let's bring them into our practice, because we can appreciate from these teachings the power of these qualities and how we can develop these qualities and really kind of allow ourselves to have a smooth course, to be able to work through dukkha, to face up to the suffering here and find ways to soften, these ways of softening and alleviating suffering. And also this sutta to recognize, if we cultivate the path factors, if we give attention, time, energy to our practice, to practicing the Eightfold Path for liberation, if we give this our all, then it's like whatever happens, whatever past karmas manifest, whatever situations we find ourselves in, it's going to be so much more easy for us to chart our course through the field of, greed, hatred, and confusion, and just keep going in this direction of nibbana. So we spare ourselves, so much trauma, upset. As Richard said, we have a choice. We always have the choice whether to rail against our fate and complain and blame others and blame and judge ourselves, or whether to just take it in our stride with the resources that we have as practitioners, and to just allow all the experiences that we have, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, to be grist for the mill, to be seen, to be understood, and so to be let go of. So thank you so much, everyone, for your kind attention. Thank you for your comments, wise reflections. I just love the shared wisdom in a group like this. It's so rich. I'm so grateful to you all. May I invite our dear venerables at Aranya Bodhi, if you wouldn't mind, so we can look at the Buddha there, with you there, and we can all bow to the Buddha, if you could lead the closing homage for us. Thank you. The Lord, the perfectly enlightened and blessed one, I render homage to the Buddha, the blessed one. The teachings so completely explained by him, I bow to the Dhamma. The Blessed One's disciples, who have practiced well, I bow to the Sangha. Thank you, Venerables. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ayya. Thanks, everyone. See you next week. Ayya Sobhana will be back next week. I'm glad to report.